There's growing optimism about Australia's position with coronavirus, but the death toll continues to rise slowly. And there's been a bit of a wake-up call this morning with 4 or 5 new cases of community transmission in New South Wales. The scale of the carnage this virus is causing overseas is horrific. Another 2,200 deaths in the US alone just in the past 24 hours. So here are today's key developments with our coronavirus coverage. So there's been a 13th death at that Western Sydney aged care home. The New South Wales Premier has repeated her criticism about how the situation there is being handled. In Victoria, an aged care facility in Melbourne's east is linked to a virus cluster. 7 cases were confirmed yesterday, but authorities say it's too soon to determine whether people will need to be moved out of that facility. National Cabinet today is looking at a code for managing nursing homes. Leaders will also discuss plans for a return to sporting competitions at all levels. New South Wales and the Northern Territory and Tasmania too will ease some restrictions. In New South Wales, 2 adults plus children are allowed to visit other households from this evening. In the top end, people will be able to use public swimming pools, go fishing with friends and play golf. And in Tasmania, there are restrictions being eased for the northwest from this coming Monday. Additional restrictions are being imposed on April the 12th by the Tasmanian government on the state's northwest that I just mentioned. Yeah, they'll be lifted from Monday. So schools and shops will reopen as 4,000 people end 3 weeks of home isolation. 30 million Americans, or 1 in 5 workers, have lost their jobs since the pandemic began. Almost 4 million people in the US filed for unemployment benefits last week. And Russia's Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has tested positive for COVID-19 and is in quarantine. An interim Prime Minister has been appointed. So let's take a look at some of those elements in detail now. So the operator of a Western Sydney aged care home has defended its handling of a deadly coronavirus outbreak at the facility. The death of a 74-year-old man takes the death toll at Newmarch House to 13, along with 59 confirmed cases among staff and residents. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the situation is unacceptable.
It's a horrific situation, and we've called upon all the authorities to stand up, and in particular, in the last 48 hours, there has been some improvement in the way they've been communicating with the families of the residents and the residents themselves. But we've called on the Federal Minister and also appreciate the Federal Government's involved the Aged Care Assurance Advocacy Organisation to deal in the matter, to intervene, and we've called for that because what's happening there isn't acceptable. And unfortunately, you do notice a difference in the way people who run these aged care homes across the nation are dealing with the issue. Some are doing it better than others, and unfortunately, this particular operator has been left wanting on a number of levels.
So Queensland has recorded another day of no new coronavirus cases. It's the 2nd day in a row, and the 3rd time this week the state has recorded no new infections. Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk has welcomed the news ahead of tonight's easing of some stay-at-home restrictions.
Further good news for Queensland overnight, 0 new cases. So let me repeat that again, 0 new cases. And Queensland, you are doing us all proud. Thank you so much for that great collective effort. And we're all pitching in, we're all helping out. And of course, this weekend is also really crucial. So I really hope that everyone acts responsibly, that they enjoy some of the lifting of the stay-at-home restrictions, that they can get out and see their family and friends, they can go for a picnic, go for a walk in a national park. If you're doing those recreational activities, it has to be roughly within 50 kilometres of your home. But this is going to be a great opportunity for Queenslanders to really get out and enjoy the fresh air.
Victoria has recorded 3 new cases of coronavirus out in the overnight, and there's continuing concern about this aged care centre. It's the Hawthorn Grange facility in Melbourne's east. It's now on lockdown following a coronavirus cluster. Premier Daniel Andrews says it's important the community continues to follow the stage 3 restrictions in place. Here's reporter Stephanie Ferrier.
Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews says there have been 3 new cases of coronavirus in the past 24 hours, raising the state's total to 1,364. The death toll in Victoria remains unchanged at 18, and there are still 16 Victorians in hospital, 7 of those in intensive care. Now, the Premier says that it's understandable that people are frustrated with the level of restrictions when they look at the low number of case increases in the past week or so, but he says it's really important to note that Victoria remains in a fragile state and Victorians should continue with these lockdowns to ensure that we don't give up all the important gains that we've made.
We saw a spike in numbers a couple of days ago. We've had outbreaks in lots of different settings right across Victoria. We've also had significant community transmission in Victoria as well. About 10% of our case, we can't track them back to an overseas traveller. Not every state's like that. Some states have no community transmission at all.
Now, it's not yet known whether those 3 new cases involve the Hawthorn Grange aged care home in Melbourne's east, where yesterday 4 new cases were identified, that being 1 health worker and 3 residents at the facility. Now, everybody at that centre is now being tested for coronavirus, both residents and healthcare workers, and the state's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Brett Sutton, says that they are now enforcing strict protection measures, including the isolation of those positive cases and quarantining of any close contact, as well as the centre itself getting in contact with any visitors to let them know if they might have been exposed. Now, Dr. Sutton says it's still not known exactly what caused this outbreak and what the source was, whether or not it was a visitor or a health worker at the centre. There are, of course, still some very strict restrictions in Victoria. In fact, there is no easing of the restrictions like we're seeing in other states. However, the Premier says that it's really important to continue to stay at home. He is launching a big advertising, multi-platform advertising campaign, which basically thanks Victorians for their hard effort. And there is also going to be a new online portal, a free portal for comedy and music gigs that will be able to be accessed free of charge by all Victorians over the next 6 weeks. That will start on Sunday night at 7:30, where there'll be a series of music gigs and comedy shows to allow Victorians to enjoy what obviously has been a very hard hit sector in this coronavirus shutdown. Now, they have said that social distancing doesn't mean cultural distancing, and with the very wintry blast that we're going to experience over the next couple of days, it's never been a better time for Victorians to stay indoors in the warmth in front of their own screens and enjoy the best music and comedy that Victoria has to offer.
Now, the Northern Territory has become the first jurisdiction in the nation to roll out a comprehensive exit plan from coronavirus restrictions beginning today at noon. Matt Garrick, our reporter, joins us now from Darwin. So what restrictions are being lifted there today?
Good morning, Joe. Yes, well, the NT government yesterday unveiled what it has called the roadmap to the new normal, which is a staged approach to lifting restrictions, with the first of these stages starting today at noon. Probably the most major restriction to be lifted will be that of limits on public gatherings in terms of weddings and funerals, and the Darwin markets will return, which are part of the fabric up here in the top end. And look, there's also been some major developments in terms of parks, and swimming pools will be open from today, along with water parks. And for sports lovers, they will see return of non-contact sports from today, with golf and archery and shooting and other various sports along that nature. We'll also see fishing with mates returned. During the coronavirus threat, there has been restrictions on going fishing with anyone other than your family members. So with a long weekend looming now, Joe, there'll be plenty of Territorians happy to get out on a boat with their mates from today.
And Matt, this might be getting into a bit of detail that you're not fully aware of, and if it is, just say so. But with that lifting on numbers of people at weddings and funerals, is that only in relation to outdoor gatherings, and there are still restrictions in terms of the numbers of people who might be attending indoor weddings and funerals?
That is correct, Joe. They are outdoor weddings and funerals. And while there are now no longer restrictions on numbers, they are still advising to keep gatherings to around 10 people, and anything over 500 people remains banned unless it has an exemption from the NT's Chief Health Officer. I believe churches are among the venues to reopen in the next stage of the roadmap, which is on May 15th.
Yeah. And so how are the risks being managed there?
Look, with national parks are also reopening today. Some national parks, including Litchfield, which is within shooting distance from Darwin. So there'll be plenty of Territorians heading out that way today. To keep the crowds at bay, they have extra police who are going to be at the national park for this long weekend to accompany rangers who already work down there to basically make sure people are maintaining physical distancing measures and adhering to the policies in place around that. There'll also be a return of random breath tests today, which were called off during the coronavirus period.
Our road user use will be something we will be actively out and about to ensure that people understand those locations are there. We've got speed limits for a reason. Don't rush to get there. Take your time to get there. Don't drink and drive. Don't use drugs and drive. Don't use drugs, period. Do what you should do so that you can be safe, other road users can be safe, and the family you're travelling with can be safe.
And Matt, when will more businesses be allowed to reopen?
The next stage of this roadmap to the new normal, as the government's called it, Joe, will begin on May 15. It's then we'll see cafes and bars and restaurants begin to really open up to take punters. There will be strict restrictions still in place. Each of those venues will have to have a COVID-19 plan in order to be able to open, and there will be rules surrounding service of alcohol and food. In pubs, you will only be allowed to buy a drink if you purchase food as well. So that's when we're going to start seeing businesses open. June 5, we'll see the remainder of Northern Territory businesses allowed to open their doors.
And what's the situation in the Northern Territory with the numbers of cases?
Well, look, at the moment, Joe, the Northern Territory is looking good. Out of 28 cases of coronavirus that have been contracted here, 25 have recovered. There's some developing news this morning that 4 ADF personnel who were based in the Middle East, they've actually been flown to Darwin overnight on a defence plane, and they're now based at the Royal Darwin Hospital after they tested positive to coronavirus overseas while serving in the Middle East. Now, it's said that they have not come in contact with the community, and they've basically come from the RAF-based Darwin to Royal Darwin Hospital, where they're now based.
Okay, cheers. Matt Garrick, our reporter there in Darwin. National Cabinet is meeting this morning, plotting Australia's path to some form of normality as the coronavirus crisis eases. With case numbers in Australia falling, the Prime Minister is continuing his demands for a thorough, independent investigation into the source of the pandemic, despite blowback from China. Political reporter Matthew Doran has more from Parliament House in Canberra.
Joe, a few items up for discussion. First of all, looking at a standard or a code for the aged care sector. Given some of the concerns about how facilities have been handling the coronavirus, we of course know that there have been outbreaks in some aged care facilities around the country. Deaths at Newmarch in Sydney and another cluster recently discovered in Melbourne. But the Prime Minister has said that he's concerned some aged care facilities are going way beyond the necessary restrictions when it comes to dealing with effectively cocooning off their facilities from coronavirus. Some residents not only not being able to see their family and friends, but are also being shut away from carers there as well. So that will be an issue up for discussion in this meeting between the Prime Minister and state and territory leaders today. What sort of code needs to be put in place for aged care facilities to continue operating? Also on the agenda will be the issue of sport. We know it is a great Australian pastime time, and the fact that the nation has not only been in social isolation for the past few weeks, but also hasn't had the ability to partake in any sport, to watch any sport at an elite level. That has been a concern for many around the country. What will be looked at today, what rules need to be put in place to allow sporting codes to begin their games, their matches once more, not only at an elite level, but also at a community level. When it comes to people flocking to their local oval or local netball courts, do there need to be restrictions put around the number of people that can be in crowds, the number of games that can be played at the same time at a facility, issues like that, right the way up to the elite level as well. And we've heard from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer Paul Kelly today saying that a number of suggestions will be put to National Cabinet this morning, and saying that he's also had discussions with people like Gil McLachlan, the AFL boss, about just the path forward there. We're also expecting a few more updates on the modelling, on the rates of infection around the country, particularly of interest as we've heard already in this bulletin, some of those states and territories start to gradually roll back the restrictions that they've had in place for a number of weeks now.
Matthew Doran there. 5 Australian Defence Force personnel serving in the Middle East have tested positive for coronavirus. Defence says it started testing after local contractors were diagnosed with COVID-19. All 5 people are asymptomatic and have returned to Australia.